Welcome to the Adaptation Planning and Practices online training brought to you by the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub and Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. This is step 1, define location, project, and timeframes. This is a training we have offered in person and online since 2016 for forestry-focused natural resource professionals who work in rural and urban areas. This training is supported by a team of instructors who specialize in climate adaptation. If you're curious about us and want to learn more, please go to our website at forestadaptation.org/team or also at niax.org. This training guides participants through the Adaptation Workbook, a resource created by and supported by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and USDA Climate Hubs. The Adaptation Workbook is a process designed to help managers integrate climate change considerations into natural resource planning. Each step is designed for custom inputs that rely on your expert judgment and evaluation. When completed, the Adaptation Workbook can provide a clear plan and project record that reflects each project's unique goals and values. Throughout this training, we will introduce each step of the process to you and work through them together. You'll use this training to learn the process and to think critically about each step. Afterwards, we hope you'll feel empowered to use these same steps for future projects and share them with colleagues to integrate into their work too. Let's begin at step 1. Define management goals and objectives and other project details. This is a critically important step that sets context for the entire plan. This step records fundamental information about the project area or property that will be used throughout the workbook process. Because it serves as a starting point for the subsequent steps, management goals and objectives should be as specific as possible. In many instances, this information will already be available as part of a management or conservation plan or other planning documents. The key questions in this step are, where are you working? What are your management goals and objectives for this area? What is the broader community context of your project and project area? Meaning, what diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice considerations and key partners can you document? The purpose of this training is to teach you how to develop an adaptation plan in a real-world setting. So if you haven't done so already, we suggest choosing a project that you are already familiar with. A real-world project that you are familiar with will allow you to be more efficient with your time and will provide much-needed background and context that will be needed throughout the learning process. I'm going to provide a little more context on selecting the right size and complexity of your project for this training, but please let us know if you want to walk through any of this afterwards, after this lecture and on our own time. Choosing a project for this training can be a really daunting first step. I mean, dialing in and refining the details of the project scope is incredibly important. It's a balance to find a project that is the right fit for the training and for your capacity to dedicate time to deliberately think through. Using the Goldilocks graphic as a guide, we encourage projects that have some complexity, but not so much that it's overwhelming. The trick is to select a project or a portion of a larger project that contains relatively few ecosystem types and only a handful of objectives for each ecosystem. Your project can cover a larger area if the area is fairly homogeneous and not too complex. If you have a really complex ecosystem or issue, you might need to work through it at a smaller scale. If you're working at a very large scale, please contact us for additional information. After you've chosen a project, we ask that you spend some time clearly articulating a few goals and objectives that describe the overall intention of management or conservation and stewardship for this project. Defining clear goals and objectives are essential and will make the other steps of the adaptation workbook much easier. Goals are the big picture that set context for what we are trying to do at the project location. So the big picture. Sometimes we think of this also as our desired future condition and what we're trying to do. Our management goals are broad general statements and are usually not quantifiable. They express a desired state or a process to be achieved and may include desired future ecosystem conditions, habitat characteristics, forest products, or other services. They are often not attainable in the short term, and they provide the context for more specific objectives. So these really are your big picture, your vision of what you're trying to do in your place. Objectives define the precise steps to be taken to achieve the identified goals. Think of them as tiers under each goal that explain how we are going to achieve our stated goals. You may be able to draw these directly from existing management plans or documents, but it is important to note that climate change does not need to be explicitly mentioned in these objectives. Objectives are overall big picture intentions for management and the plans you may already have to achieve those. We are going to apply the climate adaptation lens throughout later in the training, so you don't need to worry about including it off the bat. And in fact, it's better if you don't. Looking closer at our examples on this slide, you can see one goal and objective set relates to maintaining and improving the health of North Brook as a cold water fish resource. The objective might be to increase riparian vegetation cover along 300 feet of stream bank over the next 5 years. You can see how the goal is big and broad and the objectives are more detailed, describing how we're going to achieve those goals. While curating goals and objectives, it is important to consider the desired future characteristics of the location, such as forest conditions, habitat characteristics, while also considering the importance of this place now and in the future to our community. Use this training to explore what is possible at the scale that you are working. When applying a DEIJ lens to project plans, you may decide to adjust existing goals and objectives or decide to create new goals that are specifically DEIJ focused. Now let's walk through the definitions of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, DEI&J. Diversity, embracing a broad range of perspectives and from diverse communities to address climate changes. Equity, also shown in this image. Equity, ensuring fair distribution of climate adaptation resources and benefits, especially for vulnerable groups. Inclusion, actively engaging all stakeholders, including marginalized groups, in adaptation planning and decisions. Justice, advocating for fairness and protection of rights, addressing historical inequalities in climate adaptation and decisions. Again, we encourage you to think through the lens of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice when conceptualizing your goals and objectives. And if you need additional resources, please check them out on our website. You can find more at forestadaptation.org/DEIJ-resources. So those definitions provide a nice conceptual framework, but we really want you to think through how to integrate DEI&J considerations through each step of this process. To facilitate this thinking, we ask that you evaluate your project plans and ask yourself these considerations for step 1. Key considerations. What is the broader community context of your project? Can you identify any DEIJ considerations and partners to include? Consider how this will influence your project goals and objectives. Looking at our projects from a different angle can ensure that they are robust to potential vulnerabilities. Taking the time to assess your project location. Who are your project partners? Who are you not working with but may be a good partner to engage throughout? What partner organization should you begin building relationships with to support DEIJ outcomes? Here is a simple example. And once we look at this, I'm sure you can imagine how these examples could evolve or become more involved as you consider DEIJ more in your planning. So the example, a conservation area is located just outside of a major metropolitan area. That's the broader community context for the project. We have reached out to partner with a community nonprofit focused on improving outdoor recreation opportunities for individuals with disabilities. We're identifying these DEIJ considerations and potential partners to include in our planning. Lastly, one of our project goals is to create and/or modify park amenities to improve access and to accommodate a variety of disabilities. We're considering how including DEIJ will influence our project goals and objectives. So not to hammer these points home too hard, but as we think through our project that we're going to work on in the course, in this training, we want to remind you that it's really important to thoroughly evaluate your goals and objectives. And in some cases, it's really helpful to think through the lens of this SMART methodology. So if your goals are the big picture of what you're trying to do, then your objectives are the detailed descriptions of how you're going to achieve your goals. Make sure they're SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Looking at some more examples, we have here 2 different topics, recreation from a mountain bike connector to timber in the northern hardwoods. I'm going to read the recreation example. Our management goal is to develop high-quality mountain bike trail that offers a robust recreational experience. Linked to that goal is an objective to build 3 miles of easy to moderate mountain bike trail that meets NFS standards within 5 years. You can see how it's more specific and time-bound. Another goal, minimize impacts to recreation infrastructure. The objective linked to that, trails should not need major maintenance work over the next 10 years. The time bound being 10 years. So you can see how these examples really show that SMART methodology. So now let's get specific. As you begin to work through the adaptation workbook, you will have to answer some discrete variables within the workbook. As you start to define your location and project details, think about your project's big topics or units. What are the major attributes of your project area? Consider segmenting the project into topics or units, such as forest type groups, habitats, and key features of the site, like infrastructure or cultural sites. Defining these special areas will create a space for a discrete assessment of climate vulnerabilities and adaptation actions. When defining units within your project, try to strike a balance between the number of units that adequately describe your project area without going overboard. Depending on the overall size of your property, consider focusing on maybe 1 or 2 different topics for this training. But if your project is on the smaller side, it may feel doable to include all relevant management units. So check in with yourself to sort of assess how doable it feels to include multiple topics. And remember, after this training, you can always go back to evaluate more areas or topics as you wish. This really is an iterative process. For the purposes of this training, many of you have already submitted a project. So please refine your thinking. Evaluate your submitted project. Use existing goals that might be listed in your management or conservation project plans. Please do not recreate the wheel. We want this training to be complementary to existing plans, so draw upon your existing goals. Using those existing goals, we encourage you to think about that long vision for your project area. And so to that end, please do not include climate change in your goals or objectives. Think of the big picture of what you are trying to achieve. Also, reflect on the major topic areas and assign at least 1 goal for each management topic. We suggest no more than 4 goals for each topic area. When refining your objectives, try to be as specific as possible, linking at least 1 objective to 1 goal. Try to incorporate that SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound methodology, thinking about a time that is not near term, but might be a little bit further out, 10 or 20 or more years. Really push yourself to think about objectives that can be achieved over the long term. Do your best to integrate DEI and J considerations as we discussed earlier. And lastly, take a look at your project plan and refine your list of objectives to somewhere between 3 to 12 objectives. We really want you to complete the training and we don't want you to get too overwhelmed. Remember, you can always go back and redo this process with additional objectives and units after this training. Okay, and that concludes description of step 1 of the Adaptation Workbook for the Adaptation Planning and Practices training. Please contact us for more information.